Okay, so I was looking up caregiver stuff, and I found you, Dr. Mary Beth, and your website, petcaregiverburden.com, and learning so much on this topic, right? So I thought, I know so many families that are dealing with their own pets and caregiving and the stressors, and then feeling guilty and nobody understands and the stress. So first I want to point out, and you always point this out to me, is that you're not a counselor.
That is correct. So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but really my main gig is being a faculty member and a researcher. So I wish I had all of the amazing counseling skills of some of my peers, but I'm really mostly a researcher.
That's okay, because I think sometimes that's needed to figure out what's going on. So but you've focused a lot on caregivers for human people, right? With Alzheimer's.
Yeah. So my background, actually, before I kind of jumped into the world of sort of this human animal kind of veterinary, I guess, caregiving, I was and I am a clinical neuropsychologist. So my work really kind of puts me in the domain of working with a lot of people who have dementia. And then, of course, you're working with their family caregivers. So I had previously, before kind of getting into this world, I had done research in the world of human caregiving for people who have dementia. And so that was, when I as you were kind of mentioning, you experience your own caregiver burden. That's really kind of what spurred this on for me, is that I kind of had my own experience with caregiver burden for a pet. And so I kind of started looking into it because of that.
Yeah. Well, I went to do I attended a human geriatrician conference about 3 or 4 years ago. And this is when it started clicking in my mind. So, because I'm like, what is a human geriatrician? And we don't have that in veterinary world, right? And so they said that human geriatricians focus on 3 things. Polypharmacy, so lots of drugs, you're on kidney drugs, which messes with your heart. 2 is Alzheimer's or dementia, which is a huge thing in human med. And 3 is caregiver burden. And I was like, oh my gosh, I never really talk about that in veterinary medicine, but all of our Lap of Love clients have caregiver burden, or not all, but so many do. I'm in wonderful Facebook groups, and there are some that might be here, from the LARPARD group, everybody, the Cushing's group, the cognitive dysfunction group, Mary Beth. So we've got dogs with doggy Alzheimer's, right? And it's so heartwarming, and also hurting when I see so many families dealing with this. So what can you tell us about us caregivers dealing with our pets?
Yeah, so I guess there's probably a lot of things. So the first thing that comes to mind, and actually probably I would guess that there's a fair number of people who might be tuning into this who actually are part of some of the groups that participated in some of my initial research. The very first project that we did looking at caregiver burden in people who have a sick pet was actually run through Facebook. So we kind of tapped into a lot of these groups. And I knew about them because I myself, as I was taking care of my dog, Aloe, who had so she had transitional cell carcinoma, so we were in that group, but she also had some dementia, so we were in the canine cognitive dysfunction group.
Love them.
And she had Cushing's. And so I was also in a Cushing's group. And it was kind of, I realized, there are all these groups out here and all these people kind of going through this experience, but nobody had really looked very closely at kind of what it does to a person when they are providing care, right? So being a caregiver for a loved one, whether that's a human or an animal, there can be a lot of positive things about that. There can be, like a sense of fulfilling duty and, a sense of just kind of, strengthened relationships and a lot of wonderful things can come out of being a caregiver, but there can also be a lot of stress. And what I was noticing as kind of a common thread in myself, but also in these groups that I was a part of, was that, a lot of people were experiencing that stress. And so that was our first project. And we went to a lot of these groups on Facebook, and we just looked at the relationship between caregiver burden and how much stress a person feels, how much anxiety, depression, and what a person's quality of life looks like when you have when you're caring for a sick pet and when you're experiencing caregiver burden. And we found that there are really strong relationships between experiencing that caregiver burden, kind of the strains and challenges of providing that daily care. So very strong relationships between that and the level of stress a person feels, and levels of depression, levels of anxiety, and kind of that lower quality of life. So that was kind of the very first project, actually, was kind of through these groups. So thank you to all of you, if anybody there out there actually participated. But thank you also to these groups for being there and for providing that kind of support, because it is something that people need some support and kind of need to, understand that it's a very real thing and it's an okay thing to experience because it's a really common experience.
For sure. I'm a member of all these groups, and I try to be a member, but not a vet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I'll see some medical questions and I'm not really allowed to answer them anyway. And sometimes I'll admit, guys, I get a little nervous because they'll be like, "What dose do you use on this?" And I'm like, "No." But I'm there for more of the caregiving. I've been through this. I'm a mom for a pet also. And I think they're a wonderful support group. So I think that we in the veterinary field, we don't even sometimes know what's going on in homes.
Right.
And that's what, with Lap of Love, with the benefit of going into a home and seeing them sleeping in the living room, right? I mean, if those of you have slept in the living room with your pet, you could put it in the comments, right? Because I've done it. Change the floor of your entire house. Don't go on vacation. Working is different. Arguing with your spouse or partner, have been through all of that. I think I myself have not felt necessarily depression. Am I sad when my pet dies? Yes. But for caregiving, it's more of anxiety. I can't sleep at night because I got to have one ear open for her. And if I'm going to come home and she's not there, or, am I doing the right thing? And also, it's freaking hard, right? So my girl Sam, with her spinal lymphoma, she doesn't walk well, and so she's at physical therapy today. I gotta tell you, it's a day of my respite. I don't have to worry about her because I know she's getting the best care.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Like everything that you say is, I mean, it's the experiences I had myself as a caregiver for my dog, but also kind of just really, it resonates with, what I hear from so many of the people who are participating in our research. So we usually leave kind of a comments box at the end. So we're using validated questionnaires that are kind of, it's locked in. So, a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, how much of this do you feel, right? But when we put kind of that little free text spot at the end, then people actually tell us kind of what their experience is on a more kind of qualitative basis. And what I'm hearing from you is just so similar. I mean, there's a lot of people out there that feel like they can't go on vacation, that feel like their relationships, with their spouse or with, other people that they're living with are, just a little bit more strained because of what's going on. Those feelings of, why aren't other people pitching in and helping out with this? That kind of thing. Really, really common experiences. And actually, what I would say is when we kind of tap into large samples of people who are providing care for a pet that has a terminal or chronic illness, what we find is that in general, usually at least half of the sample experiences what we consider to be elevated levels of caregiver burden. So having kind of, there's a certain, what level of caregiver burden do we expect in someone who has a healthy pet? Because of course there's still some caregiving that's involved with that. But when we look at kind of the clinically elevated level, meaning there's kind of just a certain amount above sort of what's normal for someone who has a healthy pet, when we see kind of the levels of caregiver burden that are elevated in these samples, we just see it's about half of people at least. So so it's a really common experience, and I think people tend to sometimes feel guilty about feeling that burden or experiencing that burden, or feel like when they experience it, it means that their pet is a burden. And that's not at all what that means. I mean, what it means is that you're going through a tough time, and it's a stressful thing, and it's a difficult thing. And so, I guess I like to emphasize to people that what you're experiencing is the norm, basically. And it's okay to be stressed out, and it's okay to seek support for that.
Yeah, I think support's the best thing, and especially finding people who share that same concept. Because believe it or not, even in my world, some of my friends and family don't understand. Right? I'm not gonna go out to dinner because I got to get home for Sam or whatever, and I do that half lovingly and half like I want to go out to dinner. But so, what are some ways that we can help cope? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it really sort of depends on kind of what a person's experiencing. But I mean, I think when I think kind of the first step is even just sort of acknowledging, just kind of recognizing that what you're experiencing is caregiver burden. So I think a lot of times we just kind of function on autopilot, right? We just go through life, and if we're feeling more stressed out, that comes out in being irritable, or maybe, lashing out at the people around us, or just taking it all on ourselves, and kind of not really acknowledging it. So I think the first step is to, number one, just recognize that it's something that happens and that it's normal that it happens. And then kind of when you experience it, just, kind of observe it a little bit. But instead of really focusing on it and feeling, like you need to focus on how upset you're feeling or how stressed you're feeling, really what I would recommend is, focusing on kind of what's important here. What do you want, to come out of this situation, and really kind of focusing on problem solving, and kind of looking at the next step and kind of what you can get through. So when we've done research looking at sort of what are the predictors of caregiver burden, what we find is that one of the best things that or things that kind of negatively predicts caregiver burden, so people who feel less burdened, are the people who have kind of a higher sense of self-mastery, or a sense of kind of capability in the situation. So anything that you can do to kind of, look at sort of what are the problems in front of me, and if it feels kind of overwhelming or insurmountable, like where can I get kind of a toehold? Where can I, kind of take one thing and feel successful about this one thing that I did today? That again gives you that toehold and makes you feel like you can give yourself a little bit of a pat on the back. Because I think that's when we see who experiences less of this burden, it's the people who feel like they have kind of a plan and a way to at least kind of attack the problem in a way, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. And I think that's what I do with hospice a lot, right? So I know that a lot of veterinarians are like, well, what is hospice? What are we doing? And I'm like, there's not like a magic bag of, crystals that we use or anything like that. First, if there is pain or anxiety, I want to try to manage that medically. But a big part is looking around our environment. What can we do to help the pet, whether it's, mobility issues, reducing anxiety around their house, things like that. Third up is what the pet, caregiver going through, and how can we help? And there was somebody who wrote, these comments are great. And there was somebody that said something that I'm dealing with. So Becky says, caring for a sick or older pet is almost more difficult than caring for a sick or elderly human. We have caregivers and hospice for humans, but with our pets, there's no outside help, and our pets can't tell us what's wrong. And so my girl Sam, she is a big fuzzy dog, Anatolian Shepherd, who used to go to the groomer. And I've had a mobile groomer come, and I said, my dog is basically almost paralyzed. Like, can you handle that? And they're like, sure. And she doesn't know how to handle that. So like, I can't even get help with grooming, which I know sounds like, well, what a big deal you have, but there's, fur now all over, on top of poop all over and pee all over. And it's a lot is left to us. And even though we have veterinary hospice, that's what Laughter Love does, it's different than human hospice. It's very different.
Yeah.
And I think even a plan is important. And something else that I notice a lot with my hospice clients is sometimes they'll show me all their medical records, and it could be like this thick of medical records. And I feel that they don't want me to go through it all. They want me just to see how much they've cared, how much they've done. And I think sometimes it's just giving them permission to be tired, to be exhausted, and to be okay to say goodbye.
Yeah.
Now, you and I helped a little bit with this other project about like the quality of life of the family, and maybe that being a deciding factor for euthanasia.
Yeah. So
And
another
touch on that?
project. Yeah, that project, what we were doing is looking at, a person kind of where they are in terms of considering euthanasia for their pet, and looking at, what factors really play kind of a significant role in a person making that decision. And we found the number one predictor was the animal's quality of life. So kind of what was going on with the animal and how sick they were. But actually, the second strongest predictor was caregiver burden. But other things kind of factored in there too. So things like income, things like the person's level of anticipatory grief was also kind of related to that as well. But yeah, so that burden is something that definitely plays a role in a person's consideration and thinking about euthanasia for their animal.
You got any good insight on anticipatory grief?
So anticipatory grief is something, it's not actually something that I've studied very much, except for kind of in the context of caregiver burden. We do know that it's different from caregiver burden. So grief is that bereavement response, right? It's the response to a loss, whether that is a loss that has happened or a loss that you're expecting, like that anticipatory grief. So what's funny about caregiver burden is that it tends to happen at the same time as anticipatory grief, because they're both happening in the course of illness usually. But they are actually very different things, because that grief is that response to knowing that the loss is coming, as opposed to the caregiver burden, which is, really the response to the strains and the stress of the challenges that you're dealing with in trying to provide care and kind of standing on your head, doing the best job that you can. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
Insight.
No, it's so good. And there was a lot of people that asked about that. And, I know it. I know I'm worried about Sam, and I have that. I sometimes tell families that I feel have the caregiver burden or stress, that once we euthanize their pet, they may feel relief. Right. And to not feel bad. Like, right. When my boy Duncan, I had to wake up, he had heart failure and LARPAR and a tieback, all this stuff. I had to wake up 2 or 3 times during the night to let him go out to pee. And I gotta tell you, that first night I was happy I didn't have to, although I would have given anything to spend the next 20 years waking up every 2 hours.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, though, is a really important thing, right? So it absolutely makes sense to have a sense of relief that happens at the same time as the grief, because the relief is coming from not having the caregiver burden anymore. So now you just have the grief. So if you had caregiver burden and anticipatory grief, both kind of leading up to your animal then passing away or being euthanized, it makes sense to feel a little bit lighter, because the burden is gone and now you're only dealing with the grief, which I'm not trying to minimize that grief at all. But I think, people feel guilty when they have that little bit of sense of a relief, and they shouldn't, because the caregiver burden is gone.
Right. It doesn't mean you didn't love them. It doesn't mean you're not missing them, right? You're so, that's what it is okay, I don't have that burden. I don't have to fight with my partner. Yeah.
Because again, most people have burden and grief going on at the same time. So when the burden is gone and you just have grief, it still sucks. It's really not fun, but it's just grief instead of the two things at the same time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So good. Jen wrote, relief yet. No, also, no idea what to do with all the free time after they've passed. And like the pills, and sometimes we'll hold on to things, or we'll keep our same routine. And it's been 2 years, and I still have not thrown out my dog's drugs. And so I get it. What to do with all that time? Like, what do you do now? I think what you said earlier is really important too, is that we all need to pat each other on the back. Like, it's freaking hard.
It's absolute. Yeah.
It's hard. So worth it, though, right? If probably in return, our pets would do the same for us.
I'm sure.
Maybe not my
Shepherd mix would. I don't know. I have a Shepherd mix. I'm not sure he would do that, but my pets would for sure.
I know.
Yeah. I think, and what you mentioned, I think is such an important thing too, is, another way of coping is potentially to really think about what are you getting, because most people, and this is another research study that we did, we looked at the comparison of dementia caregiver burden and pet caregiver burden, but we also looked at dementia positive aspects of caregiving and pet positive aspects of caregiving. So what we found was that people who are providing care for someone who has dementia, they have greater caregiver burden, although it's elevated both for the pet owners and for dementia caregivers. We see elevated caregiver burden higher in the people who are providing care for someone with dementia overall. And, overall, that doesn't mean for everybody. But then the opposite happened with the positive aspects of caregiving. So people who are providing care for a pet have higher positive aspects of caregiving compared to people who are providing care for a loved one with dementia. And so really kind of, identifying what positive things are you getting out of the caregiving process, I think is something that can potentially be useful too, and really kind of try to lean into that, if it is in some way, giving you that sense of fulfillment, or, a lot of people experience some personal growth or kind of spiritual growth even from that experience. I've heard people say that it's almost kind of like a transcendental experience in a way to be a caregiver, and to know that you are, allowing this animal to live their last moments and, with some dignity, and doing the best that you can to provide that. And so really kind of leaning into what's positive about being a caregiver is something that can be helpful as well.
The book, Death and Dying by Dr. Kubler-Ross, she says in there, I'm going to screw this up a little bit, but basically the more we can say, I love you to someone that's passing, I don't want to say the better will grieve, because that's, again, I knew I'd screw this up, but I think that's what sometimes caregiving helps me is I'll have no regret. I know I did everything for her. Yeah. So I have two questions. One is not really a question, but I think the hardest disease for me, I don't know if this is the proper thing to say, but is our cognitive disease, like doggy dementia. Right. Because there's no, like me with Sam and cancer, she's getting chemo, I'm giving her physical therapy. I know that I'm only prolonging, but like there's just no cure for cognitive dysfunction. And it's sad, and it's just heart-wrenching, and they're not sometimes even with it. So like, just like that group, love you guys, because it's awesome to have such a good support. Now, my question to you is, what's the difference? Because it's coming up a lot in these comments, fatigue and burden.
Yeah. So fatigue really is, I think we would consider it to be one aspect of burden. So we use burden, and it's a term that not everyone loves. And I can acknowledge that. There's sometimes when I don't love the term burden, because I think it's often misunderstood. Yeah. And people think that it means like, oh, it's the burden of, the animal, or the burden of the one that I'm providing care for. Excuse me. But there's so much more that goes into caregiver burden above and beyond fatigue. So it is the fatigue, it is the exhaustion, but it's also the anger, the irritability, the frustration, not having enough time in the day, having too many responsibilities, having your health suffer, having not enough money. And so it's there's a lot of things that go into what we consider to be burden. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. But
you're black and white, and now I'm breaking up your voice.
Okay, let's see if that helps. So the reason that we use that term burden, and it's a tricky term. I can 100% recognize that, but there's so many things that go into it. Or some people say, well, why don't you say caregiver stress? And the reason really is because it's more than just that stress, right? There's the finances and the all the things that I was talking about, the feeling resentful, the anger, the frustration, the embarrassment that can sometimes accompany it. So there's a lot that goes into it. Fatigue, huge, super important, but it's just one factor. Stress, huge, but just one factor that goes into it.
Okay, that's good. I like, or not I like, but yeah, the embarrassment too. People don't realize, like, people aren't coming over my house, right? Yeah. Like, because it's not that I'm embarrassed, but I got to bring up all the mats, or I gotta, here she is laying there, right? And yeah, it's just so sad. Now, Dr. Mary Beth, I got to tell you, and I'm going to do it live here. I really want to do a talk with you one day at one of these conferences.
Absolutely, by all means, let me know. We'll do it.
Because I think, like, you know, we have so much in common for what we do. And so I want to tell everybody about your website, and I'm going to put it up here too.
Okay.
And we'll put it in the comments. So tell us about your website and how it can help.
Yeah, so petcaregiverburden.com actually is just, I consider it a science blog. So I'm a researcher, as I keep on sort of saying, but so really what we're trying to do is to make sure that our research findings that are published in the peer-reviewed research journals that the everyday person doesn't have access to, we're trying to make that accessible so that, you know, when we have new information about, you know, what are the predictors of caregiver burden, well, that is helpful to us in understanding how we can reduce caregiver burden. If we know kind of what are the factors that are causing it, it's not just having a sick pet, but it's having a sick pet and on top of that kind of a low sense of self-mastery or you know, like insufficient coping skills or something like that. So looking at that, we're able to then kind of better communicate with a layperson audience about what might be helpful for caregiving. So petcaregiverburden.com is our website where it's really just a science blog. And we actually, yeah, so I'm selling it because I want you to have the information. We actually don't have any commercial endorsement at all. So click on it. I want people to click, but I get nothing from your clicks. So it's coming from science and my heart.
I love, right. It's science, but it's from your heart, which is so good. Oop, I lost her again. Man, there you go. I think somebody's calling you.
Yeah, I guess so.
I want to apologize to everybody about our weird technology, but like I said, we've got the greatest followers, our family members. So like they usually can listen. If you're dealing with your pet, dealing with my technology issues is like nothing. So
right, absolutely.
But this has been super helpful, and I love your website. When I lecture, I always tell people about your website, so I want everybody to click. And after this, we'll also put in some links in the comments for some of the support or the Facebook groups that we mentioned, because I think they're awesome. They're wonderful. And I feel like a lurker sometimes, but I swear to gosh, I'm really just there to like for my own. And I get so many great product ideas, you know, like you say, the mastery. And I have tried like 7 different booties for my pets and all these things because I learn it from everybody else. So it's even me as a veterinarian, I find a lot of help being a part of those groups. And listen, I am so glad those years ago I found you. And thank you for bringing this to light. And I hope this has been helpful for people.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.